Hey fellow travelers, Mark here with Walter's World, and today we're going to answer a question from Julia. And Julia asks, is it expensive to travel around the US? And I'll be honest with you, when I compare traveling around the US to traveling around Europe, I actually find it cheaper to travel around Europe than the US. And the big reason is accommodation. Getting an acceptable hotel in a city like New York is going to be $300 a night, maybe $400 a night if you're a family. That's not unheard of, or more. Whereas if I go to Europe, I can get an acceptable accommodation for my family of four for maybe 150 euros in a big city like this, or less. And if you're going to smaller cities around the US, you're looking at a minimum for a Hampton Inn or a Holiday Inn or a Ramada, like the traditional chain hotels that they have here in the US, you're looking at a minimum $125 plus tax to push it to $150 to $200 a night for your hotel room. Whereas in Europe, that same hotel room, if you get like an independent hotel or something, or a bed and breakfast, might only be 50 to 70 euros a night, so $50 to $70. And so that's the big difference in the cost of travel between the US and Europe. It really is the accommodation. When it comes down to food, I find food prices around the world to be relatively similar when it compares Europe to the US. South America and Central America is a lot cheaper to eat and a lot cheaper to stay. Like South and Central America, Southeast Asia, Africa, it's a lot cheaper traveling there than the US or Europe. But if I look at other things in terms of going to museums, I find museums in the US to be a little bit more pricey than the average European museum. So if you're trying to debate where you should go, do I do a European trip or a US trip? When you're there on the ground, I think because accommodation, a stay in the US will be a bit more expensive, especially if you want to be going to big cities, okay? But one thing I will say, what keeps a lot of Americans from going to Europe is the price tag of the flights. And that's another thing. Flying to Europe, or flying to the US from Europe, or flying to Europe from the US, that's going to be your biggest one-time cost. But once you get there, you're saving money when you're in Europe. Okay, so it's something to kind of think about. But another thing I think is important when you're looking at costs comparing Europe to the US are the low-cost airline tickets. So in Europe, you might fly with Ryanair or EasyJet or Vueling, and you can get, I can go from Lisbon to Rome for 35 euros, like $35. That's the equivalent of flying from New York to, like, I don't know, LA, which is going to be like $400 or $500. It's a lot more expensive flying to the US, flying around the US than it is flying around Europe. So that's another thing you have to consider when you come here. So honestly, the US I feel is a bit more pricey. That's why we spend a lot more time traveling Europe, because we actually save more money traveling there for a longer period of time than we do come to the US. So if that answers your question, Julia, about which one's more expensive, I feel coming to the US is more expensive. That's why if you come to the US, you want to do as much as you can during your trip. Stay an extra week, because then you don't have all the extra price of flying back again. You kind of amortize those costs over a longer period of time to help you out. The same thing going to Europe. Make it a longer trip so it's more bang for your travel buck when you do go. All right? So, Julia, I hope this answered your question. I know it might be something that US tourism wants to hear, but it is, from my experience, I find that we spend a lot more money traveling around the US than we do when we're going to Europe. So, what are your travel questions? Let us know in the comments section below so we can do our best to help answer them on another video. Bye from New York City, one of the not cheap places to visit the US, but totally worth going to.